I'm going to read from the book that Dimitri mentioned, which is forthcoming, a book called Bass Cathedral. And it's the fourth in the series, From a Broken Bottle. And the series is a series of letters written by N, a musician, founding member of a band based in Los Angeles, which has had a number of names. Its current name is the Molimo Motet. It used to be called the Mystic Horn Society. And the letters have to do with the band's music and surrounding circumstance. And they're addressed to an angel of dust. And in this letter, which is towards the beginning of the book, this letter comes out of the fact that the band has put its first record together. And this is back in the days of vinyl, in the early 80s. And it's called Orphic Bend. And one of the things that happens in the volume preceding Bass Cathedral, Atet AD, is that the band begins to be beset by comic strip balloons. They play music and a balloon will emerge from the bell of a saxophone or an oboe or a trumpet. And they are quite perplexed by this. They don't know quite what the source of this is or quite what it means. But it brings a level of attention to their music that they feel, well, they end up feeling ambivalent about. And this continues, these balloon visitations continue in Bass Cathedral. And the first one actually occurs in an unusual way in that the band receives a test pressing of this 3-record set. And while they're listening to one of the tracks, Dream Thief, during the bass player's solo, Aunt Nancy's solo, balloons begin to emerge from the vinyl. And this is a new development because they've always occurred in live performances and come out of the instruments. But this is actually coming out of the vinyl artifact. And there's writing inside the balloons. And in this instance, the balloons have a good deal to say about this guitar that Aunt Nancy seems to be telling us about playing. A guitar strung with straw. And in subsequent conversations, it turns out that her father had made such a guitar for her when she was a little girl, and et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this particular letter has to do with the performance at a place called Onaji's in LA, and some of the initial things that N has to say have to do with this question of the balloons and the straw-strung guitar. Dear Angel of Dust, thank you for your letter. You raise questions I can't give the space I wish I could. Why Aunt Nancy's guitar spoke to me so I can't say. Straw had to do with antithetic detour, resonances coaxed from unprepossessing string. Foothills burnt brown in the summer came to mind. Dry grass, dry weed, and dry scrubs, an auspicious remit. It seemed I wandered those hills and heard voices, beset by anaesthetic audition, endowed with a recondite ear. Straw sought an accord with laryngitic declivity, an eviscerated call or cry, swallowed cry. Straw may well have been, I sensed it had to be, scratch to laryngitic itch, retrospect epiphany, suspect epiphany, rendered moot. Still, an advancing choir filled the dead summer air with faint, unlikely sound, tangential voices or intangible voices, all diaphragm and throat, no lips, no tongue. What I wanted was to endorse, not further encumber, Aunt Nancy's guitar. That I'm not alone in having been so spoken to became evident the other night during our gig at Onaji's. Between sets, Drenette suggested we begin with Dream Thief when we went back out on stage, a suggestion no one had any problems with. So, back on stage for set 2, that's what we did. It was during Aunt Nancy's bass solo that what I'm referring to took place. She'd been at it a short while, eyes closed as they usually are when she solos, head tilted back a bit. She now brought her head down and leaned over the bass and began to strum, punctuating her fingers' address of the strings by thumping, every now and then, the wood of the bass. She thumped with her thumb and with the heel of her hand, sometimes one, sometimes the other, a now halting, now hortative colloquy of thump and strum. Leaning over the bass, hunched over the bass, she increasingly made a cave of herself, an esoteric recess whose bodily husk housed rhythmic disbursements of thump and strum. Colloquy and cave rolled into one, she and the bass effected a unified or Unitarian house of sound, a first antiphonal church of thump-inflected strum. It was into this church that Drenette stepped in making a move that took us all by surprise. As Aunt Nancy delved more deeply into the strum and thump line, she pursued, eyes closed, her back to the wall, it seemed, of the cave she made of herself. Drenette picked up the duffel bag she keeps on the floor near the foot of the hi-hat, the bag she keeps cowbells, maracas, and such in. She picked it up and reached into it, taking out not a cowbell, maracas, or such, but a small guitar. A rough and ready affair, she later told us, she herself had made by attaching a sawed-off broomstick to a cigar box and using fishing cord for strings. So moved she'd been, she said, by the test-pressing balloons. No balloons came out of Aunt Nancy's bass on this occasion, but Drenette, in an allusion to the test-pressing emergence which, surprising though it was obvious even at the time, took out the guitar and began to play. Aunt Nancy, hunched over the bass, eyes closed, hardly expected the answering strum she heard coming from where Drenette sat. She opened her eyes and saw what the rest of us, no less unexpectedly, already saw. Drenette strumming and plucking the cigar box guitar, out of which a damped, sotto voce seeming shell of sound emerged. Damped, sotto voce seeming shell notwithstanding, it advanced a hip, infectious diddy-bop rasp and reach of irredentist huff. Drenette's guitar sought annexation of pluck-inflected strum by thump-inflected unification, it said, with Aunt Nancy's bass. Drenette, when she plucked, pulled the string out as far as she could and let go, letting it snap against the box to make a rattlish, raspy sound. She hummed, grunted, and moaned as she played, a sotto voce run of extenuated voice which brought Delta blues to mind. Even more, it brought Basumano Sissoko to mind, the old lion of Mali, the guitar sound more that of an ngoni than that of a guitar. Together, she and the guitar put forth a rolling, multiply pitched rumble, gruff and apparently offhand, but so exact it could not have come of considered application. They put forth an entwined sotto voce commotion that both spoke to and took a step farther, Aunt Nancy and the bass's antiphonal church. Aunt Nancy, nonplussed, albeit a bit taken aback, didn't miss a beat. She now not only strummed and thumped, but also plucked, snapping the strings and letting them buzz against the low end of the fingerboard. Her low-end buzz took up the guitar's ngoni-like rasp, consorting with it for a long enough stretch to become its escort, a fuzzed, otherwise ictic escort, limiting a wider aisle in a now much larger church. She somehow managed to work into the strumming, thumping, and snapping a steady 4-beat walk Leroy Vinegar would have been proud of. A walk she implied instead of stated outright as often as not. Its implicit feet felt in the strum, thump, or snap she interrupted it for. She and Jeanette were the true heroines of ictic tenancy, spooked apostles of a first tabernacular itineracy, antiphonal kin whose blue devotions mourned a felled or, if not yet felled, failing body, the church's first and most reliable house. This was the annexation Jeanette sought. She and Aunt Nancy now walked as one, an ictic promenade which acquired a crab-like meander and drift. Her cigar box guitar seemed a diminished, cautionary doppelganger to Aunt Nancy's bass, a ghost, or better, poltergeist of a claim to connection. She too, that is, now widened her repertoire, now not only strummed and plucked, but also thumped, rapping the box with her thumb and the knuckles of her third and fourth fingers. The sotto voce falsetto she now and again got into so lent itself to such thumps it seemed she tapped at a seance table. It was a rough-cut, mystical side of Jeanette we don't often see. Aunt Nancy's bass solo was now clearly something else, a lank, double-jointed duet which, loose and on speaking terms with lateral drift, made its availability or amenability to other voices abundantly clear. Penguin was the first to so avail himself. He quickly slipped backstage and returned with a broom he'd evidently noticed earlier, an old-fashioned cornstalk broom. He came back on stage holding like a guitar, strumming like a guitar. He seemed intent on reminding us that the guitar the balloons told of was strung with straw, not fishing cord. He ran his fingertips across the cornstalk straws and extracted what sound he could, an even more diminished, meager ghost of a sound than what came out of Jeanette's guitar, a sotto voce flirtation with voicelessness which, like the guitar, but even more so, put one in mind of an Ngoni. He made his way back to the mic and held the strummed straw part of the broom close to it, signaling to the fellow working the mix at the back of the room for more volume. That helped some, but it was still a forced, meager sound, pointedly hoarse and laryngitic, mostly gesture, if not all gesture, ictic tease. Whenever he left off strumming, he plucked, taking a straw between the nails of his thumb and his forefinger, part mime, part makeshift mudra, pulling it out and letting it go and exacting a clipped, anticlimactic pinch of sound. There was next to no snap, absolutely no buzz. Penguin advanced a philosophic rapport with deficit sound, if not with outright lack of sound, so measly and pinched, so miserly or deprived were the dry pricks of sound his plucking produced. It seemed he scratched at the straw for sound, strained at eking what sound out of it he could. A thirsty man on a desert scratching water from sand, he stood elated at the daunting odds he faced. He strummed and plucked, elated, oddly geared up. Strumming's dry ripple of sound in concert with plucking's dry pricks of sound introduced a thread of dry humor as well, a philosophic, self-deprecating thread seeking leverage on Jeanette and Aunt Nancy's churchical exchange, urging them to lighten up, but not without designs on churchicality itself, no sooner urging them to lighten up than advancing its own blue ictic amen. Several people in the audience laughed. Fierce, funny, desperate in its odd, elated way, Penguin's broom contributed an element one felt was absolutely apt, notwithstanding one would not have known it belonged had it not been there. Jamila was the second to avail herself of Jeanette and Aunt Nancy's crab-wise aisle, the widening promenade or prospect that all the more showed itself able to accommodate any and all who'd come, having found room for Penguin's having found room for Penguin's wry, blue ictic sachet. At the piano, she took a monkish tack, issuing plinks, anxious plunks, hesitant fills, gradually building up to longer runs. She added to Aunt Nancy and Jeanette's percussive thumps by stomping her foot every now and again, sometimes her left, sometimes her right, lifting her leg and letting it hang for the time it took to conclude a phrase, bringing her foot down hard on the floor to announce and reinforce having come to the end of the phrase. She had a way of delaying the final note of the phrase, leg suspended, not hitting it until a microbeat after her foot came down on the floor. A shade late in coming, the note had been held up, it seemed, by some impediment, stomping her foot on the floor dislodged. She'd angled her body when she lifted her leg, leaning to the right and away from the piano when she lifted her left, to the left and away from the piano when she lifted her right. She, too, it took no genius to see, sought leverage, an oblique, dislocating fulcrum furthering her own blue-ictic stroll, pianistic strut. Stride and strut were decidedly what she built up to. The others picked up on this, each greeting every impeded note she stomped her foot to free with a micro-beat hitch and a shade-late reinforcement of his or her own, an explosive thump from Aunt Nancy's bass, an impulsive pluck from Jeanette's guitar, Straw's abstract snap or extrapolative snap from Ping and Boom. These became more staggered, dispersed, strewn about as things proceeded, microbeats and more intervening among stomp, thump, pluck, and snap. The blue-ictic aisle became an eruptive expanse in which, pickup-like, these detonations took one another by surprise. This was the expanded, eruptive aisle Lambert now stepped into. Not with his horn, it turned out, but to dance. He drew abreast of the aisle's blue-ictic tread, its resident walk, starting off with a pointedly long stride to the center of the stage. Once there, he extended his arms in front of his body, hands hanging limp, the classic or stereotypic sleepwalker's pose, though his eyes remained open. His arms were extended for balance, one soon saw, as he now leaned back on his heels, letting the front of each foot come up off the floor. His heels alone touching the floor, his legs locked at the knee and at a 75-degree angle with the floor. He proceeded to step in time with the music, walking backwards in a counterclockwise circle. Lambert's dance endlessly bordered on imbalance, warded off imbalance. He ran a constant risk of leaning too far back, a risk he fought or compensated for by constantly adjusting and readjusting the position of his upper body, fought or compensated for with the quickness of his feet. His backwards walk was a levered appeal to curved earth, a conserving abandon he sought to enlist or to align himself with. It made a virtue and a game of being caught out, found an awkward beauty in finding itself on the verge of coming apart, a sustained and concrete play on being taken aback. Lambert bit his lower lip as he danced, a look of resolve, chagrin, and cool assurance all in one. The lids of his eyes lowered the longer he danced, never completely closing, but according with the sense of sleepwalk even so. The floor was flat rather than curved, one saw, but Lambert's walk reminded one this was mere appearance. So fraught was each step he took with the risk not of falling to the floor so much as falling from it. He staked a claim for ultimate stakes, intimating that to lose balance would be to vanish, disappear. Aunt Nancy and Jeanette's failed or failing body came to mind, of course, supported and propped up by the note of ultimacy Lambert struck. Jeanette let this note take the humming, grunting, and moaning she dispersed a step further, finally having recourse to words as though Lambert's walk advanced into an answering talk. She resorted to words in what she now sang, albeit words so often as not entirely clear. If you've heard Cante Hondo, or Nelson Cavaquinho, or that Billie Holiday album, Songs and Conversations, Paramount put out a few years back, you'll have an idea of the way she made a music of slurred speech. She took up with and played with the title of the piece in a now no longer sotto voce run, a run which reminded us we don't yet know what singing is, haven't yet exhausted what it can be. She sang as though she talked out loud in her sleep, a ripped, insistent talk that was garbled and articulate by turns, thick-tongued, inebriate talk in which dream and thief kept coming out. She held forth with a tone of categorical insistence, what sounded like categorical insistence, vehemently declaiming, expostulating, exhorting. But for all her vehemence, one couldn't make out whether dream was what was stolen or itself the thief, her point evidently being that no clear line separated the two, a cloudy line, separated the two. The coupling of categorical tone with cloudy assertion was a tour de force, a slurred swerve into phatic, non-predicate iteration. Lambert, meanwhile, continued his backwards walking dance. Jamila, her stomp-inducted strut. Penguin, his dry ripple and pinch. Aunt Nancy, her pluck-accompanied, strum-accompanied, thump-accompanied walk. It now fell to me to make a move. I stood put upon by a phrase I heard inside my head. Given all one has to mourn or lament, were the words which said themselves, it seemed, again and again, words which began a sentence I couldn't complete. Possessed of a non-predicate truth, or the sense of a truth which put completion on the tip of one's tongue, only to withhold it, I had no choice but to put a horn in my mouth. All I wanted was to feel the reed vibrate against my lip, the sense of extension, completion even, the horn, a straight one, would give my tongue. I took up my soprano and put it in my mouth, content with merely percussive bleats and blurps to begin with, but surprising myself by falling in with Lambert. It was an impulse I followed without giving any thought, joining the dance he continued to make of courting imbalance, the backwards walking circle he went round and round in. I fell in behind Lambert, that is, facing his back, but in another sense, in front, dancing backwards myself as though I led the way, Pied Piper-like. The soprano was the pipe I enticed him with, charmed him with, his already sleepwalk-seeming tread all the more so now. Percussive bleeps and blurps gave way to a more sinuous vein, a snake charmer's vein. He followed my lead, mesmerized it seemed, although it was I who had followed his, a reversal or a confounding of back and front, which augmented or extended Trinette's confounding of dream and thief. I walked flat-footed at first, backing round and round as I played, but the more I played, the more I continued to in fact follow Lambert's lead. The more I played, the more I leaned back, finally letting my toes and the balls of my feet leave the floor, dancing on my heels as did Lambert, my arms out in front holding the horn, elbows raised for balance. I too leaned at a 75-degree angle. My raised elbows felt like wings. It seemed I'd fly backwards, lift off at exactly that angle at any moment. Though that moment never came, I felt for a sustained, seemingly endless instant how right Aunt Nancy had been. We were each the arm of a universal itch, a shared, angling arm eternally bent on leverage, though Archimedean crowbar, crack in the cosmic egg, call it what you will. Whether it was an in or an out we sought, we could not have said. We did find our way to the bridge in due course. Did get back to the head and wind up the piece. It was evidently one of our best that night. Later, as we left the club, we saw several people who'd been in the audience milling around on the sidewalk outside. One of them spotted us and yelled out, "Yeah, Dream Thief." He then leaned back at a 75-degree angle and proceeded to walk backwards on his heels, arms out in front. Yours, yeah. Yes.
In the same sense, Angela, do you think that there's a difference between your audiences in terms of poetry versus prose? And if so, what would be the ideal audience? Would the ideal audience be in a classroom? Would it be in a jazz hall? Or would it be in some hybrid place like where we are right now, where everything sort of comes together?
This feels pretty good in here. Obviously the ideal reader is the reader who takes all three of those and doesn't feel there's a schism, or and if not feeling that it's a seamless continuum, between them, connecting them, at least feels there's a continuum. I guess readers who decide they like one but not the other. I like the fiction but I don't like the poetry, or vice versa, or I like the criticism and I don't like any of that other stuff. I would not consider ideal.